the war that almost ended ancient Egypt, and how they survived. The Golden Age before the storm, long before the fire and chaos, before the desperate battles on the Nile and the fall of kingdoms, there was peace, a golden peace, so radiant that later generations would struggle to believe it ever existed. Egypt, the kingdom of gods and kings, stood untouched by the storms that shattered the world beyond its borders. While other empires rose and fell like waves crashing on distant shores, Egypt endured, calm, eternal, unbroken. It was a land carved by the Nile, the river that gave life where the desert would gladly take it. Every year the floodwaters rose, carrying black silt that nourished the fields. Wheat, barley, figs, onions. The abundance seemed almost divine. Farmers offered thanks to Hapi. Priests sang hymns in temples that glowed with gold, and the people believed the gods had chosen Egypt as their sacred home. The outside world might burn, but here was order, and order was everything. The height of power. The kingdom was ruled by a pharaoh whose authority was absolute. His word was law, his image worshipped, his power unquestioned. He was the son of Ra, the living embodiment of Horus, the shepherd of the two lands. Egypt's bureaucracy was unmatched. Scribes recorded everything from harvest yields to military rations. Architects designed temples that pierced the heavens. Generals maintained a disciplined army, ready to crush any threat. The empire stretched deep into Nubia, reached into Canaan, and commanded trading routes that brought lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, cedar from Lebanon, and gold from the south. It seemed unshakable, eternal, immortal. Yet beneath the golden glory, something else was beginning to stir. Small cracks in the foundations, too subtle for most to see, but dangerous enough to doom a civilization. Selim, the first sings of decay. Egypt's greatest weakness was also its greatest pride. Stability. For generations, peace had softened the upper classes. Corruption seeped into the priesthood. Sacred temples became places of influence more than spiritual devotion. Officials began to think more of their own wealth than the kingdom's. Tax collectors skimmed grain from farmers. Generals grew comfortable in their villas rather than sharpening their swords. The system still functioned, but barely, like a statue beginning to crumble under its own weight. Pharaohs grew weaker. Some ruled only in name, while advisors whispered commands behind their throne. Succession disputes created tension among nobles, and even the Nile, the heartbeat of the kingdom, grew unpredictable. Some years it flooded too little, others too much. Harvests faltered, storage houses began to thin. But Egypt did not panic. Egypt never panicked. After all, had they not survived for thousands of years? Had the gods not always protected them? The people trusted tradition. The priests trusted the temples. The nobles trusted their wealth. And the generals trusted the belief that Egypt's enemies lived too far away to be a threat. They were wrong. The land, the outside world burns. While Egypt enjoyed its quiet luxury, the entire Mediterranean world was unraveling. Cities that had stood for centuries began to fall. Trade collapsed. Empires trembled. A darkness spread from land to land like a plague carried by the wind. Across the sea, mysterious invaders descended upon the great powers of the age, the Mycenaeans, the Hittite Empire, the cities of Canaan. They came not as merchants or diplomats, but as destroyers. Fortresses crumbled, entire cultures vanished, without leaving their names behind. The ancient world did not know what to call them, but later generations would give them a name: the Sea Peoples. They were not a single nation. They were a storm. Refugees, warriors, raiders, desperate tribes driven by hunger, drought, collapse, or ambition. No one truly knew where they came from. Their ships carried warriors with horned helmets, round shields, and weapons crafted for slaughter. When they struck, they tore through armies and cities, like a knife through papyrus, and as the storm moved closer, the world shook. Salalumle Egyptite, remains blind reports, reached Egypt of entire kingdoms falling. Letters arrived from ambassadors begging for help. Trade vessels failed to return. Merchants told stories of smoke rising from the coasts of the Levant. But Egypt, proud Egypt, believed itself untouchable. The court claimed the sea peoples were a distant problem. Priests assured the people that the gods would never allow Egypt to fall. Officials insisted that the chaos across the sea was exaggerated. Their arrogance was ancient. Their confidence was legendary. But fate does not respect pride, and the sea peoples were moving south toward Egypt with a hunger that could swallow nations. The land grows weak. As the storm approached, Egypt suffered its worst blows from within. The economy strained under years of poor harvests. Storage houses emptied faster than they filled. Nobles hoarded grain for themselves, angering the people. Illegal taxes rose. Workers rebelled at Deir el-Medina, the first recorded labor strike in human history. Even the temples felt the tension. Priests argued over rituals, their wealth threatened by the kingdom's financial collapse. The army, once mighty, now lacked supplies. Shields rotted, bows weakened, chariots stood unrepaired in dusty storehouses. Egypt was beginning to fracture, but the most dangerous crack was leadership. The pharaoh on the throne was aging, frail, and indecisive. He could administer ceremonies, but not command legions. Egypt needed a warrior, a strategist, a king capable of facing a threat unlike anything the world had known. But such a leader had not yet risen, and the sea peoples were almost here. The calm before destruction. For the last time, Egypt slept in fragile peace. Markets bustled. Children played along the riverbanks. Priests performed rituals in golden temples. The pharaoh presided over ceremonies with all the splendor of his ancestors. But beneath the surface, everyone felt it, an unease that crept through the air like a shadow. Birds migrated strangely. Fishermen reported unfamiliar ships near the coast. The winds carried rumors of burning cities. Egypt stood on the edge of a blade, unaware that the greatest threat in its history was preparing to strike. And when the storm finally arrived, it would hit with such fury that Egypt itself would tremble and nearly fall. But from the ashes, a new leader would rise, a man destined to save what remained of an empire. His name would be Ramesses III. While Egypt enjoyed the last fragile years of its golden age, a storm was gathering far beyond the horizon, a storm that had already erased nations older than memory. But Egypt, wrapped in its pride and rituals, refused to believe that anything could threaten the land of the gods. They were wrong. Someone the whisper before the row. The first warnings came quietly. Merchants arriving from the north spoke of strange ships with curved hulls and painted prows. They described warriors wearing horned helmets, carrying round shields, and wielding blades unlike anything seen before. These men did not negotiate. They did not trade. They did not warn. They attacked. Villages along the Anatolian coast disappeared overnight. Smoke rose from islands that had thrived for centuries. Trading ports fell silent. Fishermen vanished without a trace, their boats found drifting empty in the waves. The Egyptians dismissed these tales as exaggerations of foreign sailors. But the truth was worse than the stories. Iselolon, the destruction of empires. To understand the terror approaching Egypt, one must understand what had already been lost. The Hittite Empire, once a rival to Egypt, collapsed in a matter of years. Their capital, Hattusa, fortified, magnificent, ancient, was left a charred skeleton of stone. Once mighty armies were crushed. Cities that had stood for centuries fell like brittle reeds. Across the sea, the Mycenaean kingdoms, the world of heroes and palaces, burned. Pylos, Tiryns, Mycenae itself, ruined. Their grand halls, once filled with gold, lay silent and broken. The great city-states of Canaan faced waves of destruction. Some fled inland, others vanished entirely. Letters found in Egyptian archives begged their pharaoh for help. The enemy is at the gates. They burn our cities. They kill our people. Without Egypt, we are lost. But Egypt, absorbed in its internal problems, could send no help. It had no idea that the same fate was marching toward its own borders. Wansel and Wad, which were the sea peoples. Even now, historians debate their origins. Were they warriors fleeing a collapsed homeland, refugees driven by famine, a loose alliance of pirate tribes, or a migrating population desperate for new lands? Egyptians simply called them the peoples from the sea. They came in massive fleets, families, warriors, whole populations moving together. They traveled with wagons and livestock, carrying everything they owned. This was not a raiding force. It was a civilization on the move, and wherever they passed, destruction followed. They did not conquer cities. They erased them. They did not occupy foreign kingdoms. They replaced them. The tide moves south. As more kingdoms fell, the sea peoples turned their gaze to the richest prize left untouched. Egypt's spies brought terrifying reports. Entire islands emptied of people, armies slaughtered, palaces burned, trade routes destroyed, ships arriving loaded with foreign refugees, fleeing unknown enemies, maps on palace walls, filled with red markers representing lost cities. Priests saw omens predicting the swallowing of the land. Villagers along Egypt's borders saw unusual vessels scouting the coast, but officials minimized the danger. Many still believed Egypt's gods would protect them. Some even claimed the sea peoples would avoid Egypt out of respect. Those illusions died the moment the first Sea People's army reached Palestine. The skies filled with black smoke. Villages fled south. Survivors spoke of horrors. They came like locusts. They fought like demons. They left nothing alive. For the first time, Egypt truly felt fear. While in Egypt, struggles to respond, the pharaoh called emergency councils. Military garrisons were reinforced. Fortresses along the eastern frontier were alerted. But Egypt was not ready. Its army, weakened by corruption and years of neglect, was no longer the unstoppable force it once had been. Many chariots were unusable. Weapon stockpiles were inadequate. Some units had not seen real combat in decades. The priests blamed the Nile. The nobles blamed each other. The generals blamed the throne. And the people blamed the gods. All while the sea peoples drew closer. The first clashes, Egypt's first battles against the sea peoples, were disasters. In the borderlands, Egyptian patrols encountered small groups of enemy warriors. These were not untrained raiders. They fought with disciplined fury, striking quickly and fading into hills before reinforcements arrived. Their weapons shattered Egyptian shields. Their tactics confused seasoned commanders. Their war cries echoed like thunder over sand dunes. One commander reported, "They fight like men who have lost everything, and who no longer fear death." Egypt found itself facing an enemy unlike any it had fought before. This was not a rival kingdom. This was not a rebellious city-state. This was a force of destruction, so relentless it had erased entire civilizations. And now they were burning their way toward Egypt's frontier. Wansalun Sea, chaos with N, chaos without. As the sea peoples advanced, Egypt faced disaster on two fronts. Outside, invasion. Inside, collapse. Famine spread. Villagers fled their homes. Trade stopped entirely. Temples demanded more offerings, draining the treasury. Officials embezzled emergency funds. Riots erupted in cities. The army struggled to maintain discipline. Egypt was suffering death by 1,000 cuts, and the sea peoples had not even arrived in full force yet. Solomon the Pharaoh, Fails the sitting pharaoh, was overwhelmed. He issued commands, but the government moved too slowly. He tried to strengthen the army, but corruption drained resources. He tried to raise morale, but fear overshadowed every promise. Egypt needed not just a ruler, it needed a savior, someone who could see beyond rituals, beyond temples, beyond tradition, someone who could unify the two lands before the sea peoples tore them apart. And destiny answered. The rise of Lamsi, the rise of Ramses III. In the chaos of collapsing borders, rising famine, and foreign invasion, a young prince stepped forward. Ramses III. Unlike his predecessors, he was not weak, he was not indecisive. He did not hide behind priests or advisors. He was a warrior, a strategist, a leader molded by crisis. Ramses saw clearly what others refused to accept. Egypt was facing extinction. If the sea peoples were not stopped, Egypt would fall like all the kingdoms before it. Ramses made a vow to defend Egypt with every resource, every soldier, and every drop of blood the land could offer. The storm was here. The invaders were almost at the gates, and the last great pharaoh had risen. While Ramses III prepared for the battle that would decide Egypt's fate, the storm of the sea peoples was already tearing apart the outer defenses of the kingdom. Egypt had faced invasions before. Hyksos, Libyans, Nubians, but never something like this. These invaders were not an army. They were a force of nature, a civilization on the move. Homeless warriors, driven by hunger, desperation, and fury. A tide of destruction rolling across the ancient world. And before Ramses could rise as savior, Egypt would taste defeat, so bitter it would shake the kingdom to its core. The Eastern Front, collapses the warning, came not from scouts, but from smoke. Black plumes rising over the horizon, flames so tall they pierced the sky like burning spears. Villages that had stood for hundreds of years vanished in a single night. Egypt's frontier towns, Kadesh, Deji, Amuru, tried to hold the line, but they were overwhelmed. The sea peoples moved like lightning, striking with terrifying coordination. They attacked from the sea, landing troops directly onto beaches the land, pushing entire columns through the northern deserts, the rivers, navigating their curved ships inland. Egyptian soldiers, trained for chariot warfare on open fields, struggled against these swift, chaotic assaults. One officer wrote, "They came out of the water like demons. Their swords burned in the sun. Our lines broke before we could draw the first breath." Entire garrisons were wiped out. Coastal settlements fell. Refugees poured south, bringing stories of horrors Egypt had never imagined. The defeat at Djh, the first major battle, came at Djh, a strategic region controlling the coastal road into Egypt. The pharaoh sent a powerful force, chariots, infantry, archers, foreign mercenaries, commanded by experienced generals. It was meant to be a show of strength, a statement that Egypt would not be broken. But the sea peoples cared nothing for symbols. They struck with brutal speed. They used heavy swords capable of splitting shields. Their warriors fought in loose formations, unpredictable and deadly. Their women and children marched behind them with carts. This was not simply an invasion, this was resettlement by destruction. The Egyptians were overwhelmed, chariots bogged down in sand and loose stone. Archers struggled to hit fast-moving targets. Infantry lines were flanked and shattered. Reports described the same nightmare again and again. "They do not fear death," a dying soldier said. "We fought for our land." They fought because they had nothing left to lose. When the battle ended, the sands of Djh were red. Egypt had lost thousands. It was a defeat unlike any in generations, and it terrified the kingdom. Lancelon, when internal collapse continues as Egypt's armies faltered, chaos spread at home, force famine deepened. The Nile floods had been inconsistent. Warehouses emptied faster than they filled. Rebellions sparked laborers, refused to work. Villagers attacked tax collectors. Criminal gangs formed in major cities. Order priests blamed the pharaoh. They claimed the gods were angry. They demanded greater offerings, draining the treasury. Sankut nobles broke ranks. Some hoarded food, some fled south, some plotted against the throne. Egypt was no longer a united kingdom. It was a fractured world, waiting to collapse, and the sea peoples were only getting closer. The enemy gathers after their victory at Dajai. The sea peoples did what no enemy had done in centuries. They formed a massive alliance against Egypt. Tribes from the Aegean, Anatolia, Cyprus, Canaan, all united in one unstoppable wave. Their goal was not to raid Egypt. Their goal was to replace Egypt. They marched with wagons, children, women, livestock, entire clans. The message was clear: we will take your land and make it our home. And behind them followed smoke, the smoke of dying civilizations. Pit, Loz's control of its North Egypt had always relied on the northern coast as a shield. It was rich, it was fertile, it held cities that guaranteed the kingdom's prosperity. Now it was gone. The sea peoples took coastal ports, fishing villages, trading stations, military outposts. Egypt's influence in the Levant vanished within months. Messages came to the palace: we are surrounded. They burn everything we cannot hold. Ramses III's predecessors had failed to act. Their weakness had allowed the sea peoples to advance to Egypt's door. Now it would fall to Ramses to stop them. The pharaoh's darkest moments before Ramses III could lead his armies. He faced the greatest fear of all. What if Egypt could not be saved? He walked through half-empty granaries. He inspected broken chariots. He listened to generals describe defeats in trembling voices. He read the pleas of starving villages. He watched the smoke rising from distant northern towns. He knew the truth. Egypt was not ready. Egypt was not strong. Egypt was on the brink of collapse. Ramses prayed to the gods. He offered gifts. He pleaded for guidance. But deep down he understood. The gods would not save Egypt. He would, so long when Ramses takes command. Ramses III acted with a clarity no one else possessed. He reorganized the army, or repaired chariots, or reforged weapons, trained new archers, or recruited foreign mercenaries, rallied loyal generals. He fortified cities. One raised walls. One dug defensive trenches. One built watchtowers. One pavilions. He prepared traps along the Nile. One naval blockades. One archers hidden in reeds. One fire ships. One barriers across waterways. He became not just a pharaoh, but a war commander. Ramses knew the sea peoples were coming in two forces, one by land, through the northern deserts, one by sea, through the Nile Delta. It would be the greatest assault Egypt had ever known. If Ramses failed, Egypt would die. Solemn Lov, the stage is set for the final struggle. Word spread that the sea peoples were marching south in numbers too large to count. Families, warriors, carts, ships. The sky darkened with smoke. Refugees flooded into Egypt. The scent of burning cities carried on the wind. Egypt trembled. The old world trembled. But Ramses III did not tremble. He mounted his chariot, looked toward the horizon and said, "I will protect Egypt, even if it costs me my life." The war was coming, the kind of war that ends kingdoms. A war Egypt might not survive, but this was not the end. This was the beginning of the greatest battle of the Bronze Age. Egypt was crumbling. The sea peoples burned their way down the Levant. Villages emptied. Fields lay barren. Cities fell without a cry for help, because the help would never come. And in the heart of this dying kingdom, the throne of the pharaoh stood surrounded by uncertainty, fear, and whispers of doom. Egypt had known many pharaohs, builders, priests, warriors, and tyrants, but none in recent memory had faced a threat this monstrous. What Egypt needed was not a ruler, it needed a savior, and destiny gave them Ramses III. Al-Alan, the making of a savior. Ramses III was not born into luxury, he was born into duty. His childhood was shaped by stories of the great warrior pharaohs, Thutmose III, Seti III, Ramses the Great. He listened to tales of empire, chariot warfare, diplomacy, and conquest. Egypt had once been the hammer of the world, striking fear into kingdoms from the Euphrates to the Sudan. But the Egypt he inherited was weak, divided, and exhausted. The Nile's gifts were shrinking. The priesthood had grown too powerful. The treasury was running dry, and the borders burned. Ramses grew up watching the kingdom he loved fall apart, piece by piece. He learned one painful truth: peace cannot be preserved by weak hands. From a young age, he trained in the arts of war, chariot riding, archery, spear combat. He studied diplomacy, logistics, religion, and politics. Unlike many noble youths, Ramses did not become soft. He became sharp, determined, controlled, and above all, he became a strategist. He understood something no one else did. Egypt was not facing a normal enemy. The Sea Peoples were not raiders. They were a migrating force of destruction. To stop them, Egypt needed not just soldiers, but a leader who could outthink and outmaneuver a collapsing world. The pharaoh Egypt needed. When Ramses finally ascended the throne, Egypt was already in crisis. Refugees crowded the borders. The economy was staggering. The army was demoralized. The Sea Peoples were only miles away. But while others trembled, Ramses saw clarity. His first words as pharaoh were recorded: "Egypt shall not fall in my reign." Unlike his predecessors, Ramses did not hide behind temples or councils. He took command with iron in his voice and fire in his eyes. He dismissed corrupt officials. He confronted disloyal nobles. He reorganized the priesthood's influence. He restored discipline through the ranks. Egypt had a leader again, and the enemy felt it. Was Said, the pharaoh who prepared for doom. Ramses III understood that Egypt could not survive a direct invasion unless every part of the kingdom was reforged. So he rebuilt what had been broken. He rebuilt the military. Ramses inspected every garrison personally. He retrained archers in new formations. He refitted chariots with stronger wheels and sharper blades. He replenished the ranks with Nubian, Libyan, and Shirdan mercenaries. He turned Egypt's weakened army into a force ready to face annihilation. He fortified the delta, knowing the Sea Peoples would come from both sea and land. Ramses created a defensive network, fortified river mouths, hidden archer positions, naval patrols, reinforced watchtowers, emergency supply depots. He prepared not just for battle, but for survival. He stabilized the economy. Grain was rationed, supply lines were secured, temple resources were redirected to military use. Farmers and workers received protection from bandits and rebels. Egypt could not fight if it could not eat. He unified the people. Ramses toured the land, from Thebes to Memphis, rallying the spirit of Egypt. He spoke in temples, on riverbanks, in marketplaces. He reminded Egyptians, "We are the people of the Nile. We bend, but we do not break." And slowly hope returned. The enemy approaches, despite Ramses' best efforts. The Sea Peoples continued their march. Scouts reported monstrous numbers, warriors clad in bronze armor, entire families traveling with them, wagons filled with tools of war, fleets of ships, with curved prows and carved beasts. This was not an army. This was an entire civilization on the move, and they were heading straight toward Egypt. But Ramses III was ready. Someone loaned the pharaoh's strategic brilliance. Ramses III devised a plan unlike anything Egypt had seen in centuries. A plan historians still study today. He knew, fighting them in open plains equals sign defeat. Fighting them city by city equals sign too slow. Fighting them at the delta alone equals sign too risky. So he prepared two theaters of war. Solomon IV, the land trap. He fortified the northern borders, forcing the Sea Peoples into narrow kill zones where chariots and archers would have the advantage. To Solomon IV. Solomon IV Untold filled the Nile Delta with hidden ships, archers on riverbanks, and obstacles underground. The Sea Peoples expected a simple conquest. Instead, they would walk into a series of deadly Egyptian traps. Ramses III was no mere warrior. He was a master tactician. The moment before war, as the Sea Peoples approached, Ramses gathered his commanders. Maps covered the war room. Scouts ran in and out with reports. Priests prayed for divine favor. Scribes recorded Ramses's commands at lightning speed. The pharaoh stood in the center, calm and focused. His generals watched him with respect and awe. He spoke, "They come to extinguish our world, so we will give them a storm they cannot survive." That night, the army slept under the open sky. They knew what was coming. They could hear distant drums carried by the wind. They could see faint fires burning in the north. Egypt had faced plagues, invaders, rebellions, but never extinction. This battle would decide everything. Ramses becomes the Lion of Egypt. On the eve of war, Ramses III rode along the lines of his soldiers. He did not hide behind guards or priests. He looked every warrior in the eyes, Egyptian, Nubian, Libyan, Shurdan. He raised his spear and shouted, "Tonight, we stand on the edge of the world. Tomorrow, we fight for its survival." The army roared in response. This was not the Egypt of weak pharaohs. This was an Egypt reborn in fire, and Ramses III was at its heart, a lion preparing to defend his pride. Nul solemn the stage, for the greatest battle is set. The Sea Peoples were now at Egypt's doorstep. Their ships filled the horizon. Their wagons filled the deserts. Their drums shook the earth. And at that moment, when the world was ready to collapse, Ramses III stepped into his destiny. The greatest battle of the Bronze Age was about to begin. The Sea Peoples had come, not as raiders or wanderers, but as a tidal wave of destruction. Their ships, sleek, fast, carved with monstrous faces, covered the horizon like a swarm of black insects. Their armies, families, warriors, entire tribes marched across the desert toward the Nile Delta, dragging wagons, weapons, and dreams of a new homeland. They had destroyed the Hittites. They had erased kingdoms from Cyprus to Canaan, and now they were preparing to claim Egypt itself. But Egypt was no ordinary land, and Ramses III was no ordinary king. He had not rebuilt the army for nothing. He had not fortified the delta for nothing. He had not prepared traps, ambushes, and strategies for nothing. This was the moment he had been born for, the moment the gods had prepared him for. This was the battle that would decide the fate of the ancient world. Nazalanwan, the invasion begins. The sea peoples advanced in two unstoppable waves. One Salanwan, the land column. Thousands marched along the coast, warriors surrounded by wagons, carrying families, livestock, supplies, weapons. It was a traveling nation. They moved slowly, confidently, because no one before Ramses had been able to stop them. The naval armada. Their ships sailed along the coast and into the mouths of the Nile. The prows were shaped like animal heads, boars, bulls, birds, designed to strike fear before striking flesh. Together, land and sea, they moved like two jaws of a predator, closing on Egypt. But what they did not know, Egypt was ready. Ramses III had transformed the Nile Delta into a killing ground. Hidden archers, camouflaged infantry, barricades under the water, weighted nets, fire cannons on boats, chariots waiting in the sands. The Sea Peoples thought Egypt was weak, but under Ramses, Egypt had become a trap. Wan Salomtri, the land battle. Dijahi's revenge, the land forces of the Sea Peoples, encountered the first Egyptian ambush near a narrow passage at the edge of the delta. The Egyptians attacked from high ground, arrows raining like hail, slingers hammering their shields, spearmen flooding the flanks. The Sea Peoples were fierce and unbreakable, but the terrain betrayed them. Wagons overturned, families scattered, Warriors died, protecting the very people they brought with them. Still, they pushed forward. The Egyptians retreated in stages, not in defeat, but in invitation. They lured the enemy deeper and deeper into terrain that Ramses III had chosen with purpose. Tight passages, soft sand, marshy wetlands. The sea people struggled. The Egyptians adapted, but this was only the beginning. The true battlefield waited at the Nile's mouth. The naval battle, the trap springs the sea peoples. Ships entered the delta with confidence. They believed the Nile would be an easy path inland. They believed Egypt had no navy strong enough to challenge them. But what they saw next changed everything. From behind the reeds, behind curves in the river, behind natural cover, Egyptian warships emerged. They were not sleek or elegant. They were brutal, heavily armored, packed with archers. The sea peoples laughed at first. Their ships were faster, lighter, built for ramming. But Ramses III was not planning a naval duel. He was planning annihilation. The archers of the Nile. When the invaders sailed deeper into the river, archers hidden on both banks emerged from the reeds. Then the Nile erupted in fire. Arrows rained from both sides. Flaming projectiles set ships ablaze. Spears flew like a storm. The sea peoples tried to maneuver, but their ships became trapped in narrow channels. That's when the underwater traps hit weighted nets, rose from below, sharpened stakes, pierced hulls, hidden barriers, forced ships to crash into each other. The sea peoples had walked into a death corridor, and Ramses III struck from all sides. He recorded the moment in his own inscriptions. They were dragged, overturned, shattered. Not one escaped. The final salon, the final clash. Ramses leads the storm. Ramses III did something no pharaoh had done in generations. He led the battle personally. He rode his chariot along the shore, shouting commands across the river. His archers formed wave after wave. His troops moved in perfect coordination. His generals carried out every trap flawlessly. The enemy tried to board Egyptian ships, but Ramses unleashed armored infantry, smashing them back into the water. The sea peoples tried to regroup, but Egyptian chariots struck their land forces at the same moment their naval forces faltered. The battlefield was chaos. The air reeked of smoke, blood, and salted wind. Men screamed as ships burned. Families fled into marshes. Warriors drowned under the weight of their own armor. And amidst it all, Ramses III stood firm, a lion among jackals. The inscription on the Medinet Habu temple reads, "I, Ramses, cast them into the fire of my wrath." Their ships were overturned. Their warriors sank in the sea. The sea peoples had crushed civilizations, but they could not crush Egypt. Not today, not under Ramses. Egypt had survived. The sea peoples had been crushed. The Nile remained Egyptian, and the ancient kingdom still stood strong and proud in the eyes of the world. But beneath the triumphant inscriptions, beneath the songs praising Ramses III, beneath the murals of victory carved into temple walls, something else was happening. Something darker, something fragile, something deadly. Egypt had won the war, but the cost of that survival would slowly tear the kingdom apart from within. Wan Salon, the hidden cost of victory. The Battle of the Nile had not been a single clash. It had been months, even years, of constant fighting, mobilization, and sacrifice. When a kingdom fights for its life, everything bends toward war. Granaries are emptied, treasuries are drained, farmers are drafted, trade collapses. Temples demand more offerings. Roads crumble, weapons rust faster than they can be repaired. Egypt had poured its soul into surviving the sea peoples. Now came the reckoning. While Solon won, the economy collapses. The first signs were always the same. Grain, or rather, the lack of it. The Nile floods had been inconsistent for years, and now, with so many farmers taken to war or killed in raids, harvests diminished even more. Prices rose, riots began, food caravans were ambushed. bread became a luxury for the poor. For the first time in living memory, Egyptians whispered, "Are the gods abandoning us?" And the priests, instead of calming them, demanded more offerings, more gold, more grain, more work. The temples grew rich, the people grew desperate. The power of the priests grows. Ramses III was a warrior, a commander, a savior in battle. But Egypt's spiritual world was controlled not by the pharaoh, but by the priests of Amun, a force so wealthy and so powerful that even a king struggled to control them. For every victory Ramses won, the temples demanded credit. It was Amun who saved Egypt. It was the gods who destroyed the sea peoples. The pharaoh must give thanks, and giving thanks meant giving land, gold, resources. Year after year, Ramses III signed over estates to temples, believing it would maintain divine favor. He did not realize he was creating a monster. By the time the sea peoples were defeated, the priesthood controlled 1/3 of Egypt's land, most of its gold, thousands of workers, massive food stores. The temple was becoming a kingdom within a kingdom, and Ramses was losing control. The amputated army war had taken its toll on the military as well. Chariots were destroyed, weapons were broken, archers were exhausted, veterans were wounded or dead, generals were aging. The army that saved Egypt was now a shadow of its former self. Ramses needed to rebuild it, but he couldn't. There was no money, no resources, no manpower. The sea peoples had been defeated, but they had taken Egypt's future strength with them. The kingdom had survived the invaders, but it could no longer wage another great war. Corruption spreads like fire in the vacuum left by war. Corruption flourished. Officials who survived the chaos took advantage of a weakened state. They stole grain from storage, tampered with taxes, forged documents, bribed guards, sold temple offerings on black markets, inflated prices in famine-struck regions. Egyptian documents from this time show a kingdom rotting from within. One scribe wrote, "The poor starve, the officials feast, justice is a ghost." Ramses III issued decrees against corruption, but his commands were ignored. The war had weakened him. The priests overshadowed him. The nobles feared him. The people loved him. But love does not repair a kingdom. The people suffer. Egypt's ordinary citizens bore the heaviest burden. Villages that fed armies for years now found themselves starving. Farmers returned from war to find their homes burned or abandoned. Entire families had disappeared into the chaos. Children grew up in hunger, and everywhere, people remembered the sea peoples with terror. Even though they were defeated, fear lingered in the hearts of Egypt's people. Many slept with weapons beside their beds. Khaki scribes wrote that the shadow of the northerners haunted the land for decades. War leaves scars deeper than any blade. Wansalon, the royal court, turns against the pharaoh. Ramses III had saved Egypt, but his victory made him enemies. Some nobles saw him as too powerful. Some priests saw him as too independent. Some officials hated his attempts to purge corruption. A conspiracy began in the palace. Quiet at first, then bold. Servants whispered, wives plotted, advisors deceived, generals stayed silent, and deep within the women's quarters of the palace, a plot took shape to kill Ramses III and place another prince on the throne. His greatest victory had also created the seeds of his downfall. The final blow, the harem conspiracy. The conspirators struck during a festival night. Their blades were sharp, their courage fueled by promises of power. Their target, the man who had saved Egypt. The details remain shrouded in secrecy, but surviving papyri suggests that Ramses III was ambushed and stabbed multiple times. His throat was cut, his body bled. Egypt's savior was murdered by his own household. He died as many heroes do, not at the hands of a foreign enemy, but by the betrayal of those he trusted. One solemn the price of survival. The sea peoples were defeated. Egypt still stood. The Nile still flowed. The temples still shone with gold. But Egypt was no longer the same. The victory had cost its economy, its military, its unity. its leadership, and ultimately, its greatest pharaoh. Egypt had survived the greatest invasion of the ancient world, but it would never return to its former glory. This war, the war that almost ended Egypt, had instead begun its slow decline. The war was over. The Sea Peoples were defeated. Egypt still stood, battered, shaken, but alive. But in the quiet that followed the chaos, in the long shadow cast by the victory, the true legacy of Ramses III began to reveal itself. It was a legacy of triumph and tragedy, of salvation and slow destruction, of a kingdom saved from annihilation, yet doomed to decline. For Ramses III was the last great pharaoh, the final guardian of Egypt's ancient majesty, the last roar before the long silence, the shattered world he saved. To truly understand his legacy, one must look at what Egypt had survived. When the Sea Peoples invaded, they didn't just threaten towns or borders, they threatened civilization itself. They had destroyed the Mycenaean kingdoms of Greece, the Hittite Empire, the cities of Cyprus, the coast of Canaan, numerous island cultures. They erased languages, arts, traditions, and dynasties. Entire cultures vanished from history. Egypt was the only great civilization of the late Bronze Age to survive the catastrophic collapse. And it survived because one man refused to bow. Without Ramses III, the world we know today would not exist. There would be no later kingdoms of Nubia and Kush influenced by Egypt, no spread of Egyptian culture throughout Africa and the Mediterranean, no centuries of temples, priests, and dynasties that followed. Egypt would have ceased to exist, and history would have lost one of its greatest lights. That alone is a legacy unmatched by many rulers. The price of that survival. But victory always demands sacrifice. Egypt, after Ramses III, was alive, but it was no longer the empire of Thutmose III or Ramses the Great. It was a kingdom holding itself together with tired hands. The war had drained the treasury, the granaries, the army, the trade routes, the trust in leadership. Ramses III saved Egypt, but he could not save it from the consequences. The Bronze Age world had collapsed. Egypt survived, but isolated, weakened, and slowly sinking into decline. The Sea Peoples did not conquer Egypt, but they shattered the world Egypt depended on. Trade never fully recovered. Foreign allies were gone. Distant cities became ruins or new tribal lands. Egypt stood alone in a changed world. Even the gods seemed quieter. Tumola Slun, the power shift, temples rise above pharaohs in his effort to maintain divine support during the war. Ramses III had given vast amounts of land, wealth, and power to the priesthood. It was a necessary sacrifice, but a deadly one. The Temple of Amun became so powerful that it functioned like a second government. They owned ships, farms, herds, slaves, and armies of workers. They could raise their own funds. They could influence politics. They could challenge pharaohs. After Ramses' death, the priesthood would quietly become the true rulers of Egypt, while the kings became ceremonial figureheads. The old balance, Pharaoh above all, was gone. Egypt survived the Sea Peoples, but the internal shift of power would haunt it for centuries. The kingdom, after his death, Ramses' assassination, left Egypt in shock. Conspirators were captured and executed. Princes were put on trial. His tomb was sealed with honor, his mummified body wrapped in amulets and blessings. Yet the kingdom he left behind was deeply wounded. His son Ramses IV inherited a state already struggling to stand. Each generation after became weaker, each pharaoh less capable, each dynasty shorter. The glory of Egypt faded like sunlight on stone. Within a few centuries, foreign powers would begin to encroach. Nubians, Libyans, Assyrians, Persians. Eventually, Egypt, the mighty kingdom of the Nile, would fall under foreign rule. But the memory of Ramses III endured, while Solon, the last great pharaoh, Historians and archaeologists would later call him the last great pharaoh, the defender Egypt, the lion of the Delta, the protector of civilization, the man who stopped the Bronze Age collapse. His temple at Medinet Habu still stands, a fortress carved with scenes of his battles. There, we see him driving his chariot, commanding archers, and crushing the sea peoples beneath his spear. The inscriptions boast, not one escaped. He saved Egypt from the peoples of the foreign lands. He made the two lands stand firm. They are not exaggerations. They are truth. Without Ramses III, Egypt would have died in flames. The true legacy. Survival against. The impossible Ramses III's legacy is not measured in land conquered, or monuments built, or wealth gathered. His legacy is survival. He preserved Egypt's religion, Egypt's culture, Egypt's language, Egypt's identity, Egypt's continuity. He ensured that Egypt would live on not only for decades, but for centuries after his death. He kept the flame of a 2,000-year-old civilization burning when the rest of the world fell into darkness. When empires died, Egypt lived. When cities collapsed, Egypt endured. When cultures vanished, Egypt remained. All because one man chose to fight when the world was collapsing around him. Salolum, the final image. Imagine it, brother. The sea people's ships broken in the Nile, smoke drifting across the delta, the sun rising over a battlefield of ash and water, and in the center of it all, Ramses III, standing in his chariot, his armor stained, his eyes hard, his face illuminated by the dawn. A king who saved a dying world. A king who paid with his life. A king whose victory echoed through history. That is the legacy of Ramses III, the last great pharaoh, the final guardian of ancient Egypt, the man who stood against extinction and won.